Ever cut someone off and never looked back? Right, I did, if so.
My mother always knew how to make a crowd adore her. It wasn't that she was beautiful, though people said she aged gracefully. It was the way she commanded attention, as if every compliment, every laugh, every sigh had been rehearsed for her benefit. Her living room was glowing that night, filled with the soft hum of conversation and the clinking of glasses, the air heavy with the perfume she only wore for important occasions, her birthday, her anniversaries, or any evening when she could be the center of someone's admiration. I stood near the back, clutching my glass, rehearsing polite smiles like a soldier polishing weapons before a doomed battle. The moment that broke me came quietly, wrapped in laughter and champagne. She lifted her glass, a practiced smile stretching across her face. "To my favorite," she said, her voice sharp and proud, "the child who made me proud." The room erupted in laughter. A few guests clapped. Ryan raised his glass with that infuriating smirk of his, the same one he wore when he crashed her car and somehow convinced her it was my fault for never teaching him responsibility. I didn't move. I didn't laugh. I felt the kind of silence that presses on your chest like a weight, a silence only I could hear. I had grown up under that kind of silence. It had followed me through every birthday she forgot, every holiday where Ryan got the gift I asked for, every conversation that started with "Emily, you should be more like your brother." The golden child and the ghost, those were our roles, scripted long before we were old enough to question them. Ryan, with his endless string of failed startups and unpaid debts, was somehow always finding himself. I, the one who paid her own way through college and never asked for a cent, was too independent, too cold, too much. And now, at 58, she still couldn't resist making the hierarchy official in front of a room full of people who already knew the story by heart. I watched her savor the moment, the sparkle of champagne reflected in her eyes like a crown she had placed on her own head. For years, I told myself I didn't care. I told myself I had built a life without her approval, that her praise meant nothing to me. But that night, as everyone laughed, I realized it wasn't her approval I had been waiting for, it was her acknowledgement that I existed at all. When she finished her toast, Ryan bowed his head dramatically, earning another round of applause. "You're too kind, Mom," he said, like he was accepting an Oscar for Best Dependent Male. She beamed at him, and the sight almost made me laugh, because it was so predictable it felt staged. But beneath the laughter, something sharp was moving through me, a slow, controlled burn. I looked down at my purse, where a plain white envelope rested against my phone, its edges still slightly curled from being opened, read, and resealed with trembling hands. It wasn't meant to come to me. The postman had made a mistake, same last name, same street, just a few houses apart. It had been delivered the day before, and for one stupid second, I'd thought it might be a card or invitation. Instead, it was something else entirely, something that explained why Mom's phone calls had become shorter and her excuses stranger these past few months. I hadn't meant to open it. I really hadn't. But the return address had caught my eye, an office of real estate law in the city. I knew that name. It was the same firm that had handled my father's estate years ago, the one she swore she'd never have to speak to again. Inside was a notice, cold, official, stamped in red. It said that the mortgage on her house, the house she bragged about owning free and clear, was in default. And it wasn't just her name on the documents. It was Ryan's too. He had used her as a guarantor for another one of his ventures, and this time, it had caught up with her. I read the letter twice, the words blurring into each other as I realized what it meant. My mother, who spent her life pretending everything was perfect, who loved to brag about her responsible daughter and brilliant son, was one unpaid bill away from losing the house she worshipped more than any of us. I thought I'd feel pity. I didn't. I felt something colder, clarity. Every word she'd ever said about me needing to grow up, every look of disappointment, every time she refused to help because it builds character, they all folded into a single, razor-sharp thought. She had built her world on lies, and for once, I was the one holding the truth. When the laughter died down, I excused myself, pretending to refill my drink, but really just trying to stop my hands from shaking. I could hear her voice floating through the room, honeyed and confident, already telling some exaggerated story about Ryan's new consulting project. She didn't notice that her wine glass trembled slightly when she laughed, or that her guests smiled politely, the kind of smiles people wear when they're too polite to look away from a performance that's gone on too long. I went to the kitchen and stared at the envelope again, the weight of it absurdly heavy for a single sheet of paper. I could have left it at home, locked it in a drawer, pretended I never saw it. But I brought it with me, knowing exactly what I might do with it. Not because I wanted to destroy her, but because for once, I wanted her to face something she couldn't charm her way out of. As I stood there, the voices from the other room rose again, another round of laughter, another toast. My name wasn't mentioned. It never was. But this time, I wasn't invisible. Not tonight. When I walked back into the room, I caught her eye across the table. She smiled, not realizing that something in me had already shifted. She had spent my entire life turning me into the quiet one, the reasonable one, the one who never caused scenes. But as I felt the envelope pressing against my palm, I realized that silence, in its own way, can be the loudest weapon of all. I lifted my glass, matching her gaze, and smiled just enough for her to believe nothing had changed. "Happy birthday, Mom," I said, my voice calm, my heart steady. "I brought something for you." And that's when she noticed the envelope in my hand. The envelope did not look like a weapon, yet it sat on my kitchen counter the night before the party with the quiet authority of an object that knows it can rearrange a room, and I remember circling it as if it were a wild animal I did not want to startle. Reading the return address again and again until the letters of the law firm's name lost their shape and became a kind of warning bell that would not stop ringing, because there are pieces of paper you open without thinking, and there are pieces of paper that ask whether you are ready to know something you will never be able to unknow. I had told myself, in that practiced good daughter voice that still lives somewhere in my ribcage, that I would walk the 5 houses down and slip it through my mother's mail slot, that I would be respectful, that I would avoid drama, that I would stay in my lane and let her play queen of appearances while I played the dependable stagehand who irons the curtains and leaves before the applause. Yet when I slid a nail under the flap and felt the glue yield, I also felt a kind of honesty surface. The kind that does not beg permission, because truth is not disloyalty even when it ruins a performance, and I suppose that is what frightened me most. Inside, the letter was brutal in the way official language is brutal, without rhetoric or pity, only dates and amounts and the kind of sentences that read like verdicts. And as I read about the late notices and the warnings and the impending action, as I saw the phrase referencing the property that my mother described for years as her triumph and her proof of competence, and the house she said would be our unshakable foundation, I realized the signatures at the bottom were the part that mattered most, because her name was there, and right beside it, with that clumsy swoop he uses when he wants to look legitimate, was Ryan's name. And the story I had been fed about sacrifice and responsibility and who could be trusted to carry weight collapsed like a cardboard set that had never been nailed to the frame. Memory does not wait for permission either, so it delivered a parade of scenes I thought I had learned to mute. Like the time she laughed at my request for a small loan to cover the last months of graduate rent and told me that adulthood only starts when you stop asking for help, or the Christmas she announced that my brother's failed partnership had been a valuable lesson that deserved a second chance, which turned out to mean a third chance that ate the second mortgage nobody was supposed to know existed. And it was in those memories, not the letter's legal phrases, that I found the sharpness I had been trying not to feel, a thin blade that slid between my habit of restraint and the urge to make someone finally admit what they had done. I did not want a scene, at least not the kind my mother would accuse me of craving, so I folded the letter back along the exact creases it had come with, pressed the flap until it looked almost untouched, and slipped it into a neutral gift bag, so ordinary it could have held a scarf or a bottle or a set of scented candles, and even then I told myself I might hand it to her privately in the kitchen while she arranged her cake. Except I knew the kitchen would turn into a corridor of denial where she would tell me that I misunderstood, that I was being dramatic, that I should mind my own life, and I was tired of corridors, of whispers. of being the quiet one who protects the story because she is terrified of being called cruel for holding up a mirror. On the way to the party, I rehearsed versions of myself the way I used to rehearse presentations, sorting through tones and expressions and lines that would keep me from tipping into fury, because fury makes you look foolish, and I wanted to be the opposite of foolish. I wanted to be measured and surgical and, yes, a little bit wicked, not to shatter her but to unfreeze the truth that had been airbrushed into something that looked like family pride, but tasted like neglect. And as I parked down the block and watched a neighbor carry a bouquet through her front door, I made a small promise to the girl I had been, the one who learned to disappear at dinner, that I would not disappear tonight. Inside the house the air smelled like frosting and perfume, a thick sweetness that clung to the walls, and the guests had already spread themselves in clusters that reflected the usual alliances: the golf men by the window, the women who trade recipes and rumors by the island, and my mother in the center like a curated artwork, glowing under the attention, telling someone that she had taught her children to stand on their own 2 feet. A phrase that always tasted like praise when applied to me, and like absolution when applied to my brother, and I could not help the small, humorless smile that rose when I saw him at the bar describing his new venture to a cousin who has learned to nod without investing a cent. I slipped the little bag onto the gift table as if it were any other gesture of celebration and moved through the room in the practiced pattern of a person who has learned to greet, to ask polite questions, to look engaged without giving anything away. Yet as I listened to the predictable talk about promotions and weather and pockets of real estate luck, I found myself reaching for a different kind of control, the kind that does not wait for an explosion to happen but lights a small, focused fuse that leads the eye exactly where you want it to go. And perhaps that is why, when there was a lull and someone asked who wanted to start the toasts, I stepped forward with a smile that even I could not quite recognize. I lifted my glass with a steadiness that surprised me and began with a story that sounded so harmless nobody flinched. A memory about the first signature I ever gave on a lease, and how my mother told me that I should never attach my name to something unless I could carry the weight of it without complaint. And I let the room laugh at the familiar rhythm of our family motto before I turned the story half a degree and said that lately I had been thinking a lot about signatures and guarantors, and how sometimes love dresses up as rescue while quietly rewriting the risk for people who never learn to read the fine print. And I watched the laugh freeze on my brother's face while my mother's fingers tightened around her glass, like she had been asked to hold a fragile ornament that might drop at any moment. I did not accuse and I did not explain, because too much explanation is an apology, and I have apologized enough for being the person who does not require rescue, so I simply said that birthdays are ideal moments for gratitude and clarity, that the best gifts are the ones that help us tell the truth, and that before the cake arrives I would love to give our honored guest something that belongs to her, something that arrived yesterday and seems important enough to open with family present. And then I set my glass down and walked to the table with the slow, confident steps of a woman who has finally decided that silence can be sharpened into a blade, picked up the ordinary bag with the extraordinary weight, and placed it at the center of the room where I could find it without being told where to look. My mother smiled the way performers smile when the spotlight jumps to a cue they did not expect, and she reached for the ribbon with a theatrical flourish that could have made me laugh if my heart were not thrumming like a drum under a parade. And as her nails touched the glued flap that I had pressed closed with careful fingers, I felt a calm settle over me that never once appeared in all the years I tried to earn the gentle version of her love, because there is a peculiar peace in handing a person their own truth and asking them, without raising your voice, to read it aloud. The moment my mother tugged the ribbon and slid a polished nail under the flap, the room inhaled as one organism trained by years of performance to expect a punchline or a piece of glittering jewelry or perhaps a weekend getaway tucked inside a card. And for a breath, I almost felt sorry for the story about to step into the light, because stories that have lived too long in the dark do not emerge politely. They seize their place with blunt hands and make even the confident stumble, which is exactly what happened when she pulled the letter free, skimmed the first lines with the brisk satisfaction of a woman skimming praise, then slowed, blinked, and lowered the paper as if it had acquired weight while she read it. the practiced smile softening at the edges, and then falling completely as the red-stamped words did their quiet, merciless work. She tried at first to summon the old theater, chuckling that someone at the post office must have mixed up addresses again, that these bureaucratic threats are always the result of incompetence or spite. And she even attempted the easy laugh line about how banks love to make people feel small just to earn a fee, but the effort thinned out as she reached the paragraph that listed dates and amounts with the chill of a ledger, and her eyes, still skilled at finding sympathy in a crowd, could not locate a friendly place to land because sympathy avoids precision, and the letter had nothing in it except precision, including 2 signatures across the bottom that glittered like broken glass, hers and Ryan's. Twin initials that had once been offered to the universe as proof of trust and now looked like a collaboration signed in invisible ink and revealed only because the air finally shifted to the right temperature. Ryan moved first, all nervous jokes and defensive hands, reaching for the letter as if he could fold it smaller and make the numbers disappear, swearing under his breath that this was a misunderstanding and that the venture was different this time and that he had spoken to someone who promised a bridge loan next week, then blurting that I had no right to open mail not addressed to me, which might have landed if half the room had not just watched my mother toast him as the family's crown jewel. And perhaps it is unkind to admit that the timing delighted me, yet I refuse to pretend that a clean win does not taste sweet when you have been eating the wallpaper paste of restraint for most of your adult life. I did not raise my voice and I did not accuse, because accusation invites a counterstory, and I had no interest in dueling narratives that would spiral into tears and nostalgia. Instead, I lifted the microphone my cousin had left by the cake for speeches and tapped it once, not to command the room but to steady my hands, and I said that while birthdays are for gratitude, I had learned from my mother that gratitude without accountability turns into theater, so tonight I wanted to honor her most. Repeated lesson about standing on one's own 2 feet by asking the man of the hour to show us his ankles, and the laughter that followed was not cruel, but it was honest, which is a tone our family does not wear often. Yet it fit the room like fresh air blown through a window we forgot was painted shut. I walked to Ryan with the napkin and the pen the caterer had left near the bar end, keeping my smile gentle so that even my harshest relative could not accuse me of violence, asked him to do something small, something symbolic and adult, which was to write down the number of months he planned to cover the past due payments while he arranged his new financing, and I made it a public toast not to shame him, but to create a witness box large enough to hold our habit of looking away, and for a second I thought he might surprise me and write a number, any number, even 1 month, because the dignity of trying is often enough to make a room soften. Instead, he stared at the napkin, gnawed his lip like a child weighing a lie, and finally scrawled nothing. Then tried to hand the pen back, as if the gesture itself were sufficient, which is when I felt the revenge click into place, clean and almost elegant, because I took the napkin, turned to the guests who had applauded the toast to the favorite, and thanked them for joining the kind of accountability circle my mother had taught me to value more than gifts, then invited anyone who believed in Ryan's entrepreneurial genius to add their names as guarantors for a single installment. Purely symbolic if they wished, the way we sign cards and pass around baby shower games, all in good fun, of course, and the sight of people suddenly fascinated by their cake plates would have been funny if it were not so familiar. My mother moved toward me then, her voice low and composed, asking me to stop making a scene, that famous phrase women use to police other women when the truth gets loud, and I answered softly that a scene is what you make when you do not have a script. Well, tonight I had brought her the script she authored but refused to read, after which I set the napkin beneath the microphone and let it sit there like a tiny contract visible to anyone still pretending we were at a simple birthday party. And though I did not intend to be cruel, I cannot deny the satisfaction I felt when a neighbor, compelled by either curiosity or decency, stepped up and wrote 1 month in clear letters, followed by 2 cousins who offered notes rather than signatures. The room shifting from performance to conversation with the sound of small truths bumping shoulders. The cake arrived escorted by an aunt humming a strained version of Celebration, candles wobbling in a plume of waxy light that did nothing to improve the taste of the air. And as we sang the familiar song in a key that might have saved the moment if it were not so flat, I leaned toward my mother and told her that whether she chose to open the next notice alone or invite the family to witness would be entirely up to her, but that I would no longer accept the role of quiet fixer who files the edges off other people's messes to protect a story about pride, which did not sound like revenge until I watched her register that the reliable daughter had stepped off the invisible payroll. And I understood again that sometimes the cleanest payback is the refusal to continue underwriting the lie. The candles hissed out, someone cheered too loudly, and while the smoke curled upward like a small, retreating genie, a woman who used to babysit us leaned close enough that I could feel her perfume and asked, in a tone edged with worry rather than malice, whether I knew the title to the house had never properly transferred after my father died, an offhand comment offered as if it were common knowledge, which it apparently was to everyone except me, and as my mother lifted her knife to cut the first slice with hands that were finally, visibly unsteady, I felt the floor of the evening tilt. Not in victory or defeat, but in the peculiar dizziness that arrives when you realize the letter you brought to the party might not be the only letter that has been traveling toward you for years. The sentence from the former babysitter floated over the icing haze like a thread that tugged at an old tapestry, and as my mother studied the knife over the first slice with the triumphant smile of a hostess who believes she can plaster over a crack with buttercream, I felt the floor of my childhood tilt as if someone had finally reached under the rug where all the careful sweeping had been done and lifted it high enough for the dust to gain a voice, because if the title had never truly moved from my father to my mother, then the crown she wore in this house was more tiara than deed, and that changed the physics of every room we had ever stood in together. I do not pretend to be a legal savant, but grief taught me efficiency the year my father died, and in the quiet mornings when I realized that being the reliable one meant learning the difference between stories and signatures, I memorized phone numbers that mattered, so as the song stumbled into awkward clapping and cousins reached for paper plates to hide their faces, I stepped toward the hallway, pulled my phone from my purse, and scrolled past the decoys of distraction straight to the office that had once handled our estate, the firm whose envelopes carried the same severity as hospital lights, and while the line rang I watched Ryan charm a guest near the bar with that lazy grin that had closed more wallets than it had opened, and I understood with clean, almost pleasant certainty that whatever came next needed to be documented in ink, recorded somewhere no performance could erase. It was not the first time I had called that number. Earlier that afternoon, uncertain whether the letter in my bag was a misprint or a fuse, I had quietly asked a paralegal with a calm voice and a stubborn memory to check the county registry and explain in plain language who legally owned the house that hosted our rehearsed love, and when she said the transfer had been attempted but never perfected, when she explained that a neglected filing and a missing acknowledgement had left the title caught between a past intention and a present convenience, I felt the peculiar relief that arrives with the kind of truth you do not want but can use. And I asked what a daughter in my position could do to keep a foreclosure from bulldozing her father's name while the favorite child turned another apology into an invoice. The answer was not glamorous, only procedural, which is sometimes the loveliest thing in the world, and it involved recording a claim of interest, a request for notice, and a demand for copies of any default filings so that no one could quietly reshuffle the deck in a smoky back room while I smiled for photographs. So when the call connected now, with the cake sweating under the lights and the room vibrating at that dishonest party frequency where everyone yells to drown their own thoughts, I gave my name to the receptionist who recognized my father's file number faster than she remembered my voice, and I asked her to confirm whether the runner had reached the recorder's office, whether the stamped documents were on their way back, whether the reality I had decided to deliver as a gift would arrive as neatly as I imagined it, and when she said yes, that the copies had been dispatched by courier per my request, I thanked her in the tone of a woman returning a rental car in perfect condition, then slipped my phone away and walked back to the table where my mother, sensing something she could not name, had abandoned the knife to grip the back of a chair like a sailor who has finally admitted the sea is not a decorative theme. I picked up my glass not to toast, but to anchor my hands and said, without volume and without malice, that since we were speaking of favorites and responsibility, I had brought a different sort of present, one with fewer ribbons and more consequences. Because birthdays deserve clarity as much as they deserve candles, and then I told the room that I had learned earlier that day that our beloved house was still in a kind of legal limbo, that the transfer after my father's death had been half finished and then displayed as complete for convenience, and that in order to protect the man whose name had built these walls and paid for the roof that now trembled under bank letters, I had recorded documents that required any lender, investor, or well-intentioned savior to notify all interested parties before making the situation worse. I said it kindly, I said it plainly, and I watched understanding move through the guests the way a good story moves through a theater, from the front row to the balcony, changing faces into mirrors as it goes. Ryan tried to laugh, then tried to scold, then landed on that wheedling middle ground where he tells me I don't understand how business works, that there are times you move fast and fix the paperwork later. And I told him that moving fast over someone else's signature is not entrepreneurship, but a hobby with expensive props, and that from this moment forward the house would not be anyone's piggy bank or collateral toy, because the county now had my request on file and I would receive copies of every step before a single antique was posted to the curb. My mother cut in with the old accusation that I was making a private matter public, so I told her, with a softness I had earned, that I had simply matched the scale of her favorite toast to the size of the truth, and if she wanted privacy she could have purchased it years ago with honesty. Someone near the door cleared a throat just then, and the room turned as one creature to face a courier in a navy jacket holding a stiff envelope with my mother's name typed in a font that never jokes. He asked for a signature. My mother reached out of reflex, and I stepped between them with a politeness that tasted like steel to say that I would sign as the requesting party and that a copy should be left with the addressee, after which the man, who had delivered far uglier packages than this, handed me the stamped receipts with the same neutrality as the law itself, and I set them beside the napkins still lying under the microphone so that paper could speak to paper, kinship to kinship, and the party could witness the way a lie loses its posture when confronted by a date, a seal, and a chain of custody. For a beat no one moved. The candles guttered as if the cake had developed stage fright, and then I offered my mother a slice already plated, told her the frosting looked lovely and the evening could still be sweet if we let it, and explained that my gift would not take her house from her or shame her in the neighborhood. It would only ensure that any next step required the signatures of those who bore the true cost of her save-the-day habit, which meant the decisions would no longer be made in Ryan's texts or over wine with a friend who knows a guy. Then, because every chapter deserves a precise ending, I reached beneath the microphone, retrieved the napkin, slid it across to my brother one last time, and suggested that if he wanted to prove he was the pride she claimed, he could start by putting down 1 month and a date rather than a promise and a grin. He didn't write a number, of course, and I did not need him to, because the revenge had already landed where I wanted it to land, quietly, permanently, and with just enough ceremony to be remembered. So I lifted my plate, took a bite of cake that tasted better than any I had eaten in that house, and let the room sit with a new arrangement in which I was no longer the family's cleanup crew, but the inconvenient witness who had learned how to turn paper into a boundary you cannot charm your way around. The house had always looked most honest in the minutes after the guests left, when perfume and laughter drained from the air, and the furniture sat slightly crooked as if embarrassed by what it had witnessed, and that night it looked like a place recovering from surgery, intact on the surface, but emptied beneath the walls. I stood near the sink where half-melted ice cubes floated in cloudy water, listening to the hollow clicks of heels fading toward the driveway and the rustle of paper plates collapsing into the trash, and I wondered, not for the first time, whether truth always had to sound like a verdict. My mother moved quietly between the dining table and the counter, gathering forks as if motion alone could sew the evening back together. Her hands, usually sure, trembled slightly when they touched the envelope that had started it all. Ryan had been the first to escape, muttering something about needing air, though the air outside would not have been kind to him. Humiliation lingers even in open spaces. The neighbors had offered their awkward goodnights, the kind that carry both sympathy and relief, and by the time the last door closed, silence sat between us like another guest who refused to leave. I expected anger. I expected the sharp edge of her voice that used to cut through walls when I was younger, the one that began with my name drawn out like a warning, but what came instead was a quiet sigh and a phrase so small it almost disappeared. "You didn't have to do that tonight." It was not accusation but fatigue, the kind that comes when pretense finally costs more than it conceals. I told her I hadn't planned to, not exactly, but that when she raised her glass and toasted to the child who made her proud, I felt something final close inside me, a door I had been holding open out of habit. For years, I had let her version of love stand unchallenged because I thought it was my duty to protect the balance, to absorb the unfairness like weather, but standing in that room tonight, surrounded by guests who had memorized my invisibility, I realized that the balance had never existed, only a performance where I played the understudy for a part no one would ever let me rehearse. She set the forks down and asked what the point was: humiliation, justice, proof, and I told her it was none of those, that what I wanted was oxygen, a room where I could breathe without waiting for the next small dismissal dressed as affection. I said that I could have forgiven her for favoritism if it had been honest, if she had ever admitted she needed Ryan to be special so that she could still feel like a good mother despite all the cracks beneath the wallpaper. But pretending that everything was perfect had turned our family into a kind of play where truth had to sneak in wearing someone else's costume. Her eyes flickered then, the faintest break in the mask, and she whispered that Ryan had promised to fix everything, that he'd begged her not to tell me because I'd make it worse, and I almost laughed at how familiar that line sounded. How it had been the refrain of my entire upbringing: Emily will make it worse. The irony was that the only thing I had ever made worse was the illusion. I told her that I had already filed the documents, that the house was safe for now, but that the safety came with conditions she might not like, conditions that forced light into the corners she had left dim for too long. She didn't answer. She looked at the window where her reflection hovered beside mine, and I wondered whether she saw the same two women, one younger, still angry but steady, and one older, realizing too late that control and love had never been the same thing. The next morning, she called early, her voice softer than it had ever been when I was a child. She said she had read the papers again, that she'd spoken to the bank, and that she understood now that the house had been one mistake away from slipping through her hands. There was no apology, not directly, but there was something better: acknowledgement. She said, "You did what I couldn't." I didn't tell her that what I had done wasn't brave but necessary, that it came not from vengeance but from exhaustion. I only said I hoped she'd sleep better knowing the truth, though I doubted either of us would. Days passed, and the story of the birthday spread through the family with the velocity of scandal, each retelling trimming my motives into something simpler: revenge, drama, spite, but I didn't correct them. The truth was longer, heavier, less entertaining. It was the truth of a daughter who had spent half her life trying to earn applause in a room that only clapped for one person, until she finally realized that silence could be its own kind of ovation. A week later, a new letter arrived, this time addressed to me directly from the same law firm. It confirmed the recording of my claim, acknowledged my right to notification, and listed me as an interested party in all proceedings concerning the property of my late father, which meant that, on paper at least, my voice had been made permanent in a place where it had never been invited. I read it once, then folded it into a drawer. It wasn't triumph, it was punctuation. The story had already been written long ago, I had only insisted that it be read aloud. One evening, as the sky turned that indifferent gray-blue of late winter, I drove past the house and saw my mother standing on the porch, her arms wrapped around herself against the wind. She looked smaller, but not defeated, like a woman who had finally met the mirror she had avoided. I didn't stop the car. Some moments are too fragile for conversation. But as I passed, I saw her turn slightly toward the road, as if she knew I would be there, and in that glance I thought I saw something I had never seen before, a kind of recognition that no toast, no letter, no carefully curated love had ever given me. I don't know if we will ever repair what was broken that night, or if it was ever whole to begin with. But I do know this: truth, once spoken, doesn't vanish back into envelopes, and silence, once claimed, becomes a voice no one can take away. So I drove home with the window cracked open, letting the cold air sting my face, and thought about how strange it felt to be free, not because someone had forgiven me, but because I had finally stopped asking them to.